This was a real atrocity by the LVF of a Protestant and a Catholic sitting in a wee country pub, just assassinated really, you'd have to say. But because it was so close to the Good Friday Agreement, it became nearly incorporated with it. And then afterwards we heard that at some of the meetings shortly after that, Mark Durkin had talked about hitting the table and saying, are we going to let atrocities like what happened in Poyntzpass continue? Or are we just going to let this Good Friday Agreement disappear? And I'm not saying it's what got it over the line, but I'm saying it's maybe one of the contributing factors that had them get the Good Friday Agreement over the line. Poyntzpass, a wee rural village, divided by the railway and the canal into County Armagh and County Down. A very mixed village as regards religion, Protestant and Catholic. There's 4 churches, but it's a small village, 600 or 700 people, big farming area, a lot of big farmers out round it, but people have always got on well together. The railway bar Poyntzpass belongs to Canavan, has since 1885, when my great-great-grandfather bought it. He bought it as somewhere to live as well as a place to work in, and a farmland along with it. And since that, up until now, there's been Canavans behind the bar, and at the minute I'm the incumbent. Don't know if there's going to be another one after this. I can't see it maybe happening, but it's been that long in the family. I was manager of Armagh at the time, Armagh senior GAA team, along with Brian McClean. We were in Lurgan training Armagh on that particular night. It was a Tuesday night, and out on the pitch, this guy ran out of the clubhouse to say there was a phone call for me in the clubhouse. There was no mobile phones at the time, or I had no mobile phone at all, so I took a phone call, and it was Brian's wife, Joni. My wife, Geraldine, had rang her. Such was the roundabout of phone calls at the time to tell her something had happened in the pub. Now, Joni didn't know the details. She said there had been a shooting. So I rang home. Whenever Joni left the phone down, I rang home to see what had happened. Rang our own house, we don't live here. And Geraldine answered the phone and she says, there's been a shooting in the bar. I says, has there been anybody shot? She says, we think so. I says, has mother been shot? Because I knew she would have been behind the bar. And she says, I don't think she has been. But my heart was pounding. I just had my football gear on, ran out into the shouted to one of the guys behind the bar, I have to go, talk to you later, or in the clubhouse. And the boys were still out training on the pitch. They had no idea what was happening. Brian had no idea either. Jumped into the car and drove straight from Lurgan straight to here. Well, it was a Tuesday night, sheep sale on across the way here. Always was a very, very busy sheep sale. A lot of people came from all around Armagh, Down, Tyrone with their sheep and went on to the late hours. People would have come in here for a drink just to pass the time. So on that particular night, it wasn't actually our regular customers that were here. It was some of our regular customers and others who were just here for the sheep sale. Car pulled up outside just after 9 o'clock, 9:15. My mother had just started her shift. There was a young girl working behind the bar, Lynn Moody, did the bar until 9 o'clock. She was only 16 or 17. Very fortunate she wasn't working, because I don't think she would have got away that night if things, the way that things turned out. But the guys come in, and unfortunately, Philip and Damien were the first 2 seated here, just behind me on the back wall here. They were sitting there, not drinking. Both were drinking orange minerals. Damien worked as a recovery driver. He was on duty that night. Philip, I never saw Philip drinking. Just come in to have a wee bit of crack. There was talk of Philip was getting married soon. Talk of Damien maybe being best man. It wasn't confirmed, but these chats were going on amongst themselves. I was told this later. There was 3 people up in the corner here, a child, a father and a mother, and a grandfather. There was a couple of guys standing along the bar. There was a guy just in there, James E. Monaghan. There was D. Allen, that's a brother of Philip's, and Alfie Allen, his other brother, was up the back. So I think D, when he seen them coming in, he was close enough to the door, he got round the door a wee bit, out of the way type of thing. And they all went up into the back part of the bar, which is sectioned off. The guys came in, asked the 2 boys, told the 2 boys get down on the ground, put the 2 of them onto the ground here. And mother, she was behind the bar, she thought it was a robbery. So she instinctively ran in through this door here, and she put off lights, hoping it would maybe scare the people that had come in to do this crime, as she thought it was going to be. Maybe they might go back out again. But unfortunately, the gunmen, McCready and McClean, shot the two guys on the ground, 4 bullets into one into the other. Then the gunmen took 3 shots at my mother, and the 3 guns hit the side frame of the door, stuck in the side frame of the door, missed her, which was unbelievable because they seemed to be pretty well trained gunmen. Then they emptied the rest of the guns into the back corner here. There was 3 people sitting here, a daughter, a father, a grandfather, all sitting here. And then seen the guys bursting in through the door, the terrorists, and the shooting obviously started there. And then the gunmen, after they fired 3 shots at my mother, turned the gun this direction, and whatever was left in the gun, fired it into this corner. But the grandfather, or the father, I'm not sure which of it, I think it was the grandfather, laid over the top of the wee girl. She was only wee, under, I'd say 9 years of age, around that age. The bullet went through his arm. A couple of bullets went through their jackets, missed everybody, just missed everybody, and miraculously there was none of them killed. I think I counted 14 bullets that night in and around that, went round the pub, between 4 and 1 and 3 and whatever, it went round the rest of the place. I think it was 14 or 15. Then they dashed out through the door. Robley was sitting in the car. He was going to drive the escape car. He drove to Mill Road, Old Mill Road. And another car was there. Keys, David Keys was the driver of it. And they made their way to there, burned the car, and all the clothes they had on them, or most of the clothes and things they had on them, in the car, into the other car, and away back to Banbridge. All happened probably in the space of less than 2 minutes. And my mother always said it was like an eternity. When she looked back at it, it was so quick. And amazingly, afterwards, I asked this question to a very high-ranking officer, Ronnie Flanagan, at the time. I asked this question later on that night, why I was able to drive from Lurgan to here, not being stopped by army or police or anybody. A route straight coming from it ended up coming eventually from where the killers nearly came from, but I wasn't stopped. Yet people coming from Newry and the surrounding areas were stopped. Seamus Mallon was coming from a meeting in Newry. He was stopped twice coming to here, and yet they seem to have roadblocks on that side of on the south side of Poyntzpass, whereas on the north side where the actual killers came from, there was no roadblocks. And I never got an answer to this day. He couldn't tell me. He said he would get back to me, but of course he didn't. I was coming from Lurgan through Guildford, Scarva, that type of area. That would be a known Protestant area. Got to the village, and I couldn't get in at that time. There was a cordon up at the corner. Eventually I got in, and my mother and a few of the customers were in the back along with my father, Geraldine, my wife. They were in there. They were in complete shock, and nobody knew what was happening. I do know the parents of the 2 victims were in the bar afterwards, and I can't say who else came in just to see what had happened or see if they could help out. I know Colette Daly, nurse down below, and Martina McCarr, her neighbour next door, definitely were in trying to help, give first aid at that stage. I'm sure they'd never seen anything like that before. And Father Corrigan, he came in to say last rites. So there was, my mother always said it seemed like an awful time from they rang the ambulance till the ambulance arrived. It just seemed like an awful time. And it probably was only 10 minutes, 15 minutes. But I suppose when you're sitting there looking at the lads breathing, getting less and less, you think it's an awful time. But the ambulance came, all the paramedics, and then they took over. At that stage, I think people just dispersed. Then the police obviously would have been taking over the scene as well. I'm not sure because I wasn't here, I'm not sure how soon they took the scene over. They would have had to been called. How long would it have been before the police came? It could have been 10 minutes, So there was a 10-minute period there of probably mayhem. Whenever I arrived, the guys were still living when they left here. Philip and Damien were both living. They went in 2 separate ambulances. But unfortunately, by the time they got to Daisy Hill Hospital, both had passed away, somewhere en route. Gora Wood, they talked about, somewhere up that direction, and they'd passed away. Then the word started to filter through here that they were dead. And that was like a, you know, you could feel a deflation at that stage. The hope was still there when they left, that possibly they may get through it. But once that came back, it was just a complete flop, really. Everybody was just worse. They were bad starting off. It made a bad situation a lot worse. People in those situations just don't know what to do. Nobody knows what to do. And this was an area where there had been no trouble. There was nobody involved in any of these gangs or IRA, LVF, UVF. There's nobody around here during the whole troubles that we knew of had been involved in this sort of stuff. And to see people killed in your own pub, it was unreal, really. It was horrendous, but nobody knew how to deal with it. How do you deal with something like that when you've never seen it before? Even you had seen it before. I'm sure some of these police officers were shaking their heads. It was only whenever the dust settled that I saw what really had happened, and I was able to view the scene exactly. Went through it along with police officers after that. Besides, my mother was very aged at the time, and she always wanted me with her whenever she was answering questions with police officers or anybody that was coming. Not that she'd done anything wrong, but she just wanted a wee bit of help, I suppose, or a wee bit of comfort that somebody was there. Because sometimes police officers can ask you questions and you think you're the guilty party. And ultimately, a while after the whole thing had settled down, I kept asking the question, just like you did there, Philip, what was the motive? And they seemed to think that the LVF, who was a small enough part of the Protestant violent wing at that stage, were trying to create a big hit worldwide so that their organisation would get more notoriety or more fame. And that seemed to be the only reason that I could find or that I ever heard coming from anybody. I'm not even sure that's the right reason, but that seemed to be the only reason that we could think of. The funerals, I always remember the bodies coming into the village from the mortuary. And like, we were crying. Everybody was crying, coming, men, grown men, tears out of, you know, you never thought, strong people crying coming as the corpses were taken down into the village here. Seamus Mallon was a very, very good friend of my mother's over the years, and that night he was here, he came that night after shooting, so he actually was in here that night as well talking to mother, as was Mo Molan the next day. There was a chain of people coming here and you just shaking hands, and they were all, you know, they were all in shock too. They didn't expect it. And the wakes were on, and Seamus went down to Allen's here just over the road here from us, and he was sitting there at the wake, and all of a sudden David Trimble walked in. And as you know, Seamus was SDLP, David Trimble was Ulster Unionist. They were the two main parties at the time. At this Good Friday agreement, the to and fro was going between the two guys, or their parties. So Seamus just happened to say to David, what about the two of us walking up the street as a show of strength to the other family who only just live up the street and around the corner, walking distance, 200 metres. And David said, let's do it. So the two of them walked up the street, and you saw all the media following them up the street, and you know, two people that were supposed to be at loggerheads politically were able to walk up the street in Poyntzpass together because of what had happened. Every time people talk to me from outside, they always say to me, that's one thing they remember. They remember David Trimble and Seamus Mallon walking up the street together in Poyntzpass, which, you know, it must have meant something when it was in other people's views. It probably didn't mean a whole lot to us because we were, you know, we were just trying to get on with life as it was here, but it certainly seemed to resonate around the rest of Ireland. A few days after the event, the funerals, Thursday here, and the funerals are huge funerals at the weekend. It was Thursday or Friday, it may have been a Friday. Huge funerals. People came from everywhere. People that didn't know us, didn't know anybody here. People were coming from Tipperary, Cork. We were getting letters from children, school children in Limerick. All kinds of things were happening here. We didn't know these things, you know, how to deal with these things. They kept coming in. And in fairness, my mother used to read these letters, and I can see her yet reading the letters. She had a certain amount of comfort, but this belief that people away down there would even be worried about something that had happened up here. And I'm sure the same thing was probably happening in the other families. I can't say because I was never involved. As I said, I'm only telling you my side of the story. I always think that the real victims in this, along with Damien and Philip, has been the families and the people that were in the bar that night. Because they went through an event that nobody could have trained them for. They could never have expected something like that to come into their lives. And it had become such a worldwide type event at the time, which they couldn't really cope with. There was media from all around the world. They were looking questions, asking questions. These people weren't used to that type of thing. They had their own way of living around here. And all of a sudden, it was completely changed for a while anyway. People were coming asking questions. And I would say most of the people in here, I'd say all of the people in here and their families have been affected by it. You know, after we got back into the bar, a few days later, there was blood absolutely everywhere. You know, it was a horrendous scene even after the event, after the police had did their work as well. I like to see come in and, you know, whenever I got back in again, had taken the bullets, but the 3 bullet holes were up there. The blood splattered out over the wallpaper, on the floor. It had hardened obviously over the few days. It was a horrendous sight. But that was really nothing compared to what the families were going through of the 2 guys that had been shot and the other people that were in the bar as well, because it was a traumatic experience for them all. And, you know, I think every one of them that I know that was in the bar that day were affected to the day they died, and their families as well. Though they were the real losers. Damien's family, you know, mother couldn't cry for years. You know, it was really, really terrible life after that. Couldn't get over it. Her dad, the same, used to visit the grave. Sean used to visit the grave regularly. Every night he nearly was up at the grave. Just couldn't get over this. The Allens as well. Cecil, he tried his best. He wasn't in good health anyway. But he passed away, and then Ethel, that's the mother of Philip, she's kept going over the years. She's the only one still surviving, but her life, it was taken from them. They just were living with this, in this shadow. And I'd say every morning they got up, to every night they went to bed, they were thinking about it. My mother, I always remember, you know, she was a fairly strong woman, and I have to say, probably got over it better maybe than most, but she always said, you know, I wish it had been me instead of those 2 guys. They had their lives to live. I have mine nearly lived. So it was an angst on her that she felt that she should have been dead rather than them. So she had to live with that until she passed away. And I could see it every time it was mentioned. There was a cringe in her. The bar was closed, obviously, and talking to mother, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? And I spoke with Cecil Allen, that was Philip's dad, and he said, look, you know, after a week or so, it just wasn't that week, probably the following week, and he says, look, you have to open up, have to go on, you know, the thing has to go on, life has to go on. And we opened up then, and I always remember there was a curtain across the door here where the doors had been taken away, and it was eerie for a while, but then the locals were locals. They were, you know, my mother always called the customers her friends. So they gradually come back in again, and then, well, it never was forgotten. You know, eventually then the doors were put back on again. You wouldn't have seen many strangers about it. It was mostly her customers, but she was the boss at the time. I only took over after that. They gradually came back in again. The guys were convicted. It had to be one of the worst trials ever. They just sneered back. I was at practically all the sessions in the court, sneered back at the families. They were sitting, the boys were sitting in the dock. They did them differently. The 2 guys in the shooting, they were different to the other 2 guys. They were done separately. So these 2 guys just looked around, no remorse whatsoever during the whole of the court. And I always remember my mother had to get up onto the stand, and their solicitor, whoever he was, barrister, started to ask her questions, and she really didn't have any role to play other than she just turned the lights off, run out. She didn't seen 2 masked men. It was simple what she had seen. And this barrister started to barrage her a bit, and the judge says to her, I'll never forget this, Mrs. Canavan, take your time. You're not on trial here. If you don't know the answer to something that this guy asks you, just say to me, I don't know, Your Honour. don't be trying to make up anything that's not right, or don't feel you're under pressure to say something. Just say, I don't know, Your Honour. And she told me afterwards she never was as glad to hear her mum saying something down her life, because she was shaking in her boots. She was shaking, get up. She was put through the trial, you know, more so than the two guys that were on trial. They didn't care less, because they spent their while in remand, and then Good Friday Agreement came, they were let out. I would say probably 6 months, I don't know how long, and there was no justice there for the families. I'm sure they feel the same. To this day, I see people coming past on the towpath here, looking over, taking photographs. You know, it became so famous back in the day. It's nearly, on the towpath there, it's nearly like a historical place. But it's not a thing that we would talk about much. And now the 25 years coming up, there's not much talk around our village here about the 25 years. The whole talk is in the media and the Good Friday Agreement, and that's really where it's all coming from. We saw what it done to my mother, and the people around us saw what it did to them, and that wasn't good. While I suppose over the years it gets less, it never goes away.